POV, you're a grizzled Red Army commander in the summer of 1919. Finally, after months of setbacks, the Red Army is finally winning thanks to the help of your new mysterious general, who decisively led you to victory from the back of his train car, not once visiting the front line. Once the battle is over, you find his train car parked at a random station near your headquarters. Out of respect, you go inside, unannounced, to congratulate him on winning one of the largest civil wars of the 20th century. To your surprise, you find out that this mysterious general is barely 25 and is pissed at you for failing to attack fast enough. Instead of shaking your hand, he screams at you to get back to work and kicks you out of his train car. This is what Red Army commanders experienced when they finally met the legendary Red Napoleon, a nickname created by Western media. Tukhachevsky was the man who managed to win the civil war for the Bolsheviks and can be considered one of the founders of the Red Army. He gained a reputation for his cunning genius and stunning brutality as he put down his fellow countrymen with advanced weaponry and even mustard gas. Tukhachevsky was the youngest marshal of the Soviet Union and was known as one of the great modernizers of the Red Army, who predicted Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union and desperately tried to prepare his country for war, but was killed in his prime by Stalin during the Great Purge of 1937. Many historians ponder what would have happened if Tukhachevsky was still alive when the Germans invaded in 1941, if the Red Army was prepared for war instead of Stalin gutting its best leaders during the army purges. To begin, Tukhachevsky was born on February 16, 1893, on a 500-acre estate to an aristocratic family near Smolensk. Tukhachevsky came from a long line of soldiers, wandering crusaders, and Turkish noblemen that fought from Poland to Byzantium in search of glory. Eventually, Tukhachevsky's ancestors settled around Smolensk. His father was a member of the gentry class and spent his life in minor luxury but deep in debt. His father passed on to his 9 children the love of music and staunch atheism, which was rare for the time. Tukhachevsky was, by all accounts, an intelligent child but a poor student. He rarely showed up for class and spent most of his time reading history. During the Russo-Japanese War, Tukhachevsky, despite being only 11, staged a rebellion in his school to protest Tsarist autocracy. Frustrated by the education system, Tukhachevsky decided to go to military school, which was against his father's wishes. His father wanted his son to get a classical, liberal education, but eventually, after many nights of fighting, Tukhachevsky got his wish. By the outbreak of World War I, Tukhachevsky managed to turn his life around, finishing military school at the top of his class in 1914, and as a result, he was able to pick the regiment that he wanted to join. So he joined the Semyonovsky Guard, an elite regiment that protected the Tsar. Tukhachevsky found himself in the right place and time to quickly climb up the ranks for the Tsarist army. The Semyonovsky Guard was transferred to Krakow, where they faced off against the Austrians. In a letter home, the Red Bonaparte wrote, "I shall either be a general by 30 or dead." Shortly after writing the letter, Tukhachevsky led his men in a daring flank attack against the Austrians, causing them to rout in terror. For his efforts, he was given the St. Vladimir Cross, but complained that he deserved the much more prestigious Cross of St. George, which was given to his commander instead. Resentful, the Red Napoleon decided to scout German lines alone with a stolen rowboat to one-up his commander. Tukhachevsky snuck across the Vistula near Krakow at night, using his hands as a paddle. Eventually, he reached the German lines and scouted their position. To the surprise of his commander, he returned the next day alive and with valuable information on the enemy. One of the many reasons why Russia collapsed was due to the Tsar and his war ministers' overconfidence in their ability to arm and equip Russia's massive population. They reassured the French and British, their allies, that Russia could simply steamroll Germany and Austria with 800,000 troops, taking both capitals in a matter of weeks. But in reality, the Russian army didn't have enough ammo beyond a few months of fighting. Most of the troops that were conscripted were rushed through basic training and sent to the front with inadequate uniforms and equipment. On top of that, the two commanders in charge of the German front hated each other. General P.K. Rannenkampf and General Samsonov were bitter rivals since the Russo-Japanese War, and Rannenkampf allowed Samsonov's army to get encircled and destroyed during the Battle of Tannenberg. While the Russians were getting encircled at Tannenberg, the Russian High Command launched an attack into the Carpathian Mountains, which also ended in disaster with troops starving with no supply. Somewhere in this chaos, Tukhachevsky was taken prisoner and sent to a labor camp in the northern Baltic. But being a prisoner didn't stop the Red Napoleon. He didn't simply throw his hands up or thank God that he was still alive. Instead, he kept trying to escape the POW camp with the ultimate goal of returning to the front. But each escape attempt ended with Tukhachevsky either getting captured immediately or getting lost in the countryside and nearly starving to death, only to be found weeks later on the verge of death. Eventually, the prison guards decided to put the Red Napoleon in solitary confinement for his own safety, but Tukhachevsky then started tunneling. So the Germans then sent him to the ancient Ingolstadt fortress. At the fortress, Tukhachevsky befriended Charles de Gaulle, a man who also kept trying to escape captivity. As the son of a Russian aristocrat, Tukhachevsky was fluent in French, and the two broke the language barrier, becoming fast friends. They discussed everything from history to tactics, while Tukhachevsky practiced the violin. Eventually, in 1917, Russia collapsed into revolution, and the Red Napoleon decided to escaped to take part in the uprising. When a British officer found out about the escape plan, the officer told Tukhachevsky that he would be shot for being a landowner. But the Red Napoleon curtly replied, "Shot, I'll be General 25. Tukhachevsky then, during guard time, escaped and managed to sneak over 700 miles on foot back to Russia. Upon the Bolsheviks' rise to power, their chances of actually taking over Russia were slim to none. They had control of the two major cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, but that was about it, and holding on to those two cities for long seemed almost impossible. In the south, the former Tsarist officer Anton Denikin rallied the remnants of the Russian officer corps and pressed north to try and retake Moscow. In the east, the disgraced Admiral Kolchak marched from Siberia with plans of taking over Russia as ultimate dictator, while being supported by the Czech Legion, British officers, and Allied weaponry. In the west, General Nicholas Yudenich moved to take St. Petersburg with an army made up of German-trained soldiers and equipment. When Tukhachevsky made it back to Russia, the Bolsheviks were surrounded and on the verge of defeat. Upon the Red Napoleon's return, his brother, who was an early follower of Lenin, brought Tukhachevsky into the Communist Party and arranged a meeting with the leader of the Bolsheviks. Lenin was impressed with Tukhachevsky's exploits in World War I and viewed him as a kindred spirit. Despite being young and having little leadership experience, Tukhachevsky was made general of an army and sent out to Siberia. The Red Napoleon was given command of the First Red Army on the Eastern Front against the feared Czech Legion, a 45,000-strong army made up of Austrian defectors who fought with the Russians to liberate their homeland. However, once the Russians surrendered, the Legion planned on riding the Trans-Siberian Railway all the way to Vladivostok, two ships that would take them to France to finish the fight against the Germans. At first, the Bolsheviks allowed the Legion to go home, but that quickly changed with the Reds betraying the Legion. In 1918, the Czechs turned against the Bolsheviks and joined forces with Admiral Kolchak. When Tukhachevsky arrived at the front, he found his army in a chaotic mess. His troops were more like bandits than actual soldiers. Their previous commander, a former Tsarist colonel, had the reputation of being a butcher who massacred civilians and former Tsarist officers alike in the Ukrainian capital the year before, and had been on a bender ever since. On top of that, the colonel was planning on defecting to the White Russians. When Tukhachevsky tried to arrest the rogue colonel, he was taken prisoner and thrown in jail. Later that night, Tukhachevsky was freed by Bolshevik soldiers, and together they stormed the colonel's office and killed him in a shootout. While the Bolsheviks were fighting amongst themselves, the Czech Legion launched an offensive against the Reds, pushing them out of nearly all the major cities east of the Volga River. It got so bad that Trotsky had to ride out in his armored train personally to take command of the Red Army, and in some cases was seen leading his troops into battle personally. During these back and forth battles, Trotsky kicked out the Red Cross, which was feeding the starving White Russians on the other side of the Volga. Following the departure of the Red Cross, the head of the Red Army burned cities, shot prisoners, and stole food from civilians. While Trotsky was in command, Tukhachevsky became hell-bent on liberating Simbirsk, Lenin's birthplace, to redeem himself from his losing streak. The Red Bonaparte planned this offensive under the watchful eye of Red Army commissars who threatened to kill Tukhachevsky if he failed. Despite the odds being against him, the Red Bonaparte managed to conquer Simbirsk in a ruthless 3-day offensive. As his troops struggled to march forward, Tukhachevsky ordered his commissars to execute any soldier that retreated or couldn't keep up with the offensive. Thus, at the point of the bayonet, Simbirsk was brought back under Red control. Once Admiral Kolchak was contained in the north, Tukhachevsky was transferred to the southern front of Kolchak's line, where the Bolsheviks were losing. The Red Napoleon arrived in April to central Russia, where he found out that his new troops were worn down from months of hard fighting. These soldiers were low on morale and ammunition as they faced Kolchak's army at the height of its power. During the spring and early summer, the Red Bonaparte fought daring rearguard actions against the Czech Legion. Despite being contained in the north, Admiral Kolchak received Allied equipment and British training. So in 1919, he launched his final offensive in a vain attempt to win the war. However, shortly after the start of the offensive, Kolchak's troops ran out of ammunition due to rampant corruption in the rear. Kolchak's troops embezzled arms from the Allies to buy heroin, as faith in the Admiral's cause wavered. To put it simply, Kolchak's army was superior on paper but lacked the proper logistical infrastructure to support itself on the move. As a result, Kolchak's offensive ran out of steam. When Tukhachevsky discovered this weakness, he planned a daring counterattack over the Ural Mountains and asked Lenin to send every available army to support him in this offensive. With the help of fresh troops from Moscow, the Red Bonaparte steamrolled Kolchak's army, which disintegrated under the weight of the now newly invigorated Red Army. The key factor behind Tukhachevsky's victory over Kolchak was the newly created Red Army Officer Corps, which was made up of former Tsarist officers. Almost all of them were under 30, and they all took lessons from the trenches in World War I into this new revolutionary army. Ironically, all these bright young men who brought the Bolsheviks to power in the Civil War were ultimately betrayed by the Stalinist regime. Most of the commanders and generals who fought alongside the Red Bonaparte wouldn't live till 50. By late November, the Red Bonaparte chased Kolchak all the way to his capital of Omsk, deep in Siberia. Shortly after the fall of the city, the admiral was arrested by his own men, who simply wanted to go home and handed him over to the Bolsheviks. After a sloppy show trial, Admiral Kolchak was promptly promptly executed. Once Kolchak was defeated, the Red Bonaparte returned home to Moscow but begged to be transferred to the southern Russia front to fight the last major White Russian army. The Bolsheviks' last enemy, Anton Denikin, managed to drive the Reds out of Ukraine and the Caucasus. He even took Tsaritsyn, the city famously known as Stalingrad, from the Bolsheviks. But for some reason, the most talented general in the Red Army was forced to sit on the sidelines. The reason why the Red Bonaparte was benched was because of Stalin, who was leading purges in the city of Tsaritsyn. Even in the early days of the Bolsheviks, Stalin was already forming a clique of party members who would carry him to power. The reason why Stalin didn't allow the young Tukhachevsky to fight in the south was because he simply didn't trust him. But the situation grew so dire that Lenin finally sent Tukhachevsky south while Stalin was removed from command altogether. As the front in the south went from bad to worse, Tukhachevsky was given command of 5 Soviet armies with orders to crush Denikin. The Red Bonaparte from the back of his personal train car orchestrated a plan to crush the Whites once and for all. Tukhachevsky's plan was simple: a hard attack at the center followed by small pocket envelopments. The Red Bonaparte's tactics became a precursor to the Soviet Union's famous deep battle doctrine, which was used to great effect during World War II. In this offensive to destroy Denikin, the Red Bonaparte employed Simeon Badoni's 60,000-strong cavalry army against the White Russians. Badoni managed to run circles around Denikin's army and played a critical role in Tukhachevsky's breakthrough offensive. However, what really plagued Denikin was corruption. None of his weapons or equipment that the Allies sent to him reached the front line. Almost everything that was shipped over was stolen and embezzled behind White Russian lines. As a result, Denikin's army melted away in face of competent Red Army leadership. Denikin's forces then retreated with the help of the British Navy to Crimea, where the White Russians would make their famous last stand against the Bolsheviks. Yosef Pilsudski is a man I need to do a separate video on. He was a bandit, revolutionary, and terrorist. Pilsudski was a staunch anti-Russian guerrilla who single-handedly forged Poland's independence. Upon the end of the First World War, Pilsudski quickly took control the new Polish state and raised an army, hell-bent on reviving the old Polish-Lithuanian Empire. For most of the Civil War, Pilsudski was forced to sit on the sidelines as he lobbied for Allied support and bickered with White Russian generals who didn't trust him. When Denikin and Kolchak were defeated, the Marshals saw his chance and invaded the fragile Soviet state. The Bolsheviks had done a terrible job in the Civil War of administrating the new country. As a result, the Russians had no intact railways to transfer large bodies of troops to the borderlands to defend against this Polish invasion. So the initial invasion was met with little resistance. With most of the country destroyed, the Poles simply were able to march into the Baltic states and Ukraine. Tukhachevsky was then immediately transferred to the Polish front, where he quickly drew up plans to beat the Poles into submission. Lenin hoped that once Poland was taken, his Red Army would be ready to march into Germany and bring the flames of the revolution to the west. However, this initial optimism turned into disaster. First off, Tukhachevsky was riding off the high of his victories against the incompetent White Russians, so he quickly and arrogantly changed Lenin's attack plan. This completely screwed up the offensive timetables and logistical shipments for Red Army troops. On top of changing battle plans, which aren't as simple to do as in Hearts of Iron, Tukhachevsky decided to commit all his reserves in the offensive, which meant that the Red Bonaparte was all in, win or lose. The final reason for the soon-to-be disaster was because Tukhachevsky was Tukhachevsky. The young man was simply too young and too popular within the army. Other commanders, such as Stalin and his clique, were jealous of his success, and by this point were actively undermining him by seeking out their own glory instead of following his orders. As a result, this happened. Oof. Tukhachevsky ended up getting eviscerated at the Battle of Warsaw. Overstretched and stuck deep in Polish territory, the Red Bonaparte, after being promptly destroyed, ordered a quick withdrawal back to the trenches where the Russian army was stuck in World War I. After the battle, Lenin quickly made peace with Poland, leaving them independent. Tukhachevsky was pardoned for his failure to conquer Poland by Lenin, who blamed Stalin and his clique of generals for the failure to take over the country. The Civil War was over in everything but name. By 1921, all the armies that opposed the Bolsheviks' rise to power had been defeated on the battlefield. However, now that the Civil War was over, the Russian people, not the army, revolted against the Bolsheviks. It was civil war on top of civil war as the people resisted the dictatorship. This new civil war can be best described as an EU4 or Vicky II revolt, with the rebels' only goal being left alone. The most significant rebellion after the Civil War was the revolt of the Kronstadt Naval Base, which was located on an island near the heart of Russia, St. Petersburg. The sailors of Kronstadt were known as the most radical socialists in the country. The sailors played a pivotal role in the Tsar's abdication and in the revolutions that followed. But once the Civil War was over, the Kronstadt sailors began to learn of the Bolsheviks' brutality, and as a result, the sailors revolted. The Red Bonaparte arrived in the dead of winter and launched mass wave attacks against the island, which was surrounded by thick ice. The first 2 ice assaults ended in disaster, with Tukhachevsky's troops defecting to the side of the sailors out of sympathy for their cause. Frustrated, Tukhachevsky then transferred crack troops from Siberia to finish the job. These troops, who were Bolshevik zealots, quickly overwhelmed the island defenders, causing most of the leaders to flee to Finland. By taking the island, Tukhachevsky had, in the eyes of the party, redeemed himself for his failure to take Poland. Tukhachevsky was now not only a trusted general in the field, but also a loyal party enforcer entrusted with the sacred task of restoring order to the war-torn countryside. Despite the Civil War being over, guerrillas fought in a futile struggle against Bolshevik power. Upon Tukhachevsky's arrival to the countryside, he quickly devised a plan to end the rebellions once and for all. Now, you guys are astute historians. What do you think Tukhachevsky and his Bolsheviks planned on doing to bring back order to the countryside? A. Give the peasants what they want, to be left alone. B. To reestablish a reformed but fair rule of law. C. Use mustard gas and steal all their food. I'll give you a second to think it over. Alright, time's up, and the answer is, to no one's shock, C. That's right. Tukhachevsky used mustard gas to bring the rebellious provinces back under control. Eventually, with the help of heavy artillery, mustard gas, and a large number of Bolshevik troops, Tukhachevsky was able to sew most of the old Russian Empire back together. With the Civil War now officially over, Tukhachevsky was made Chief of Staff of the Red Army from 1925 to 1928, and subsequently served as the assistant in the People's Commissariat of Defense starting in 1934. 1937, he took up the role of commander of the Volga military district. Then, Tukhachevsky, for his decades of service, was made the youngest Marshal of the Soviet Union in 1935 at the age of 42. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, Tukhachevsky became a strong advocate for the modernization of the Soviet military. He played a key role in advancing Soviet aviation, mechanized forces, and airborne units. He also contributed to the development of the military doctrine known as deep battle, which played a pivotal role in World War II. Tukhachevsky effected Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. He desperately tried to reform the army, but to no one's surprise, Tukhachevsky faced accusations of treason from the Stalinist clique, who hated him since the Civil War days. Under duress, he confessed during torture that he was a German spy, with his confession being stained with his own blood. The judges who sentenced him to death didn't believe that Tukhachevsky was an actual spy, with the lead judge saying, "Tomorrow I'll be put in the same place." The Red Napoleon was then subsequently executed in 1937. Tukhachevsky was a pivotal figure in the Bolshevik victory during the Civil War, as well as playing a foundational role in the establishment of the Red Army. Distinguished as the youngest Marshal of the Soviet Union, he earned a reputation as a visionary and modernizer of the military. Anticipating the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Tukhachevsky made earnest efforts to ready his country for war. Tragically, his promising career was cut short by Stalin during the Great Purge, where Stalin ordered his execution. With his death, lesser generals would lead the Red Army into World War II.